Welcome to this week's edition of Ask John. We have questions about question number 3 in Unit 2. John, I'd like to start out with this. Many people don't realize that the Articles, it took 3.5 years for them to be ratified. Why is this so, and do you think that reveals a weakness about the Articles?
The Articles were drafted in Congress, took a year and a half to draft them, 1776 to November of 1777, and then they were sent out to the states for the state legislatures to ratify. And Article 13 of the Articles required that all 13 state legislatures should adopt before they would go into effect. And so there was an initial flurry of states that did ratify. In June and July of 1778, most of those had amendments to the Articles that they proposed. Their state legislatures proposed those amendments. They were all rejected by Congress, and so that was not a problem. But there were a number of states that held out, and Maryland was the one that held out the longest. Maryland was upset. It was one of the 4 states that were called landless states. And what that meant was they didn't have western lands. And so New Jersey, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Maryland. And Maryland said, we're fighting this revolution together for our independence, and all that land should be public federal land, and that all the states should benefit from it, not just the large states, especially Virginia, that was such a huge amount of the territory. Virginia at that time consisted of present-day Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So it was gigantic. And what Maryland was saying was that our troops helped to free that territory from British control, and therefore we ought to have some benefit from that. And so we're not going to ratify the Articles of Confederation until we get some satisfaction there. That stayed that way until through 1780. 1780 was a very difficult year for the Americans, and so there was strong pressure put upon Maryland and a couple other states to ratify. And France, in fact, put a great deal of pressure as well, saying that we needed this central government to organize and orchestrate the revolutionary activities. Finally, Maryland caved in, and in February 1781, adopted the Articles in its state legislature. Then on March 1st, 1781, the Maryland delegates to Congress signed the Articles, which was the official ratification then. All 13 states had ratified.
The committee and department systems of the Articles are quite notable. What were some of those departments, and how did they operate?
There was a gradual evolutionary process in Congress. At first, all committees were select committees, and certain individuals, prominent individuals like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or Gouverneur Morris, might serve on 10 or 15 different committees, and they were kept quite busy. Eventually, that was thought to be just too onerous on the delegates, and not the kind of consistency also that they wanted. And so permanent committees were then established with members of Congress, again, on these committees. And then it was felt that that was not satisfactory enough, and so departments were then created. These departments were to be headed by secretaries or superintendents who were not delegates to Congress. And so this is not like a parliamentary system, the English parliamentary system, in the sense that the members of Congress were not the heads of the different departments, but Congress selected these folks. And so you had the finance department that was headed up by Robert Morris. You had the Department of Foreign Affairs, which was an offshoot of the Committee of Secret Correspondence, but the Department of Foreign Affairs was headed first by Robert R. Livingston. You had a Department of War that was headed up by Benjamin Lincoln at first. And there was also a post office that Franklin was in charge of at the very beginning. Each of these departments evolves then over time. Robert Morris, as was typical in the English system, being the head of the finance department, assumed the role of de facto Prime Minister of the United States. He was quite wealthy and was a very prominent merchant that had all kinds of international activities, and people were somewhat fearful of him, thinking that he wanted to become the real dominant figure in American government. And so when he threatened, as he did frequently, that if I don't get my way on different points, I'm going to resign, Congress finally said, good, resign. And he did resign. By this time, John Jay, who had come back from being our, at first minister to Spain and then one of the peace commissioners in Paris, he came back and he was appointed the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, replacing his good friend Robert R. Livingston. And John Jay fills the void that was there, the vacuum, when Robert Morris left, and he becomes the de facto Prime Minister of the United States. So what does that mean? What did Jay do? Well, practically everything that Congress considers is run through Jay. He writes over 500 reports during his 4.5 years as Secretary for Foreign Affairs on diverse issues, not just on foreign affairs issues, but on many domestic issues as well. And he often defers to Congress, saying, I'm not well versed enough to write a resolution. More often than not, Congress would say, we like your report and we want you to write the resolution that will go out to the states. And so it was pretty well recognized that John Jay was the dominant figure, not just among Americans, but also the foreign diplomats that were in the United States. They realized that Jay, very gifted and talented person and very patriotic. Fortunately, he was patriotic and therefore he wasn't about to misuse his power that he had. But basically, John Jay was the executive power under the Articles of Confederation, serving as de facto Prime Minister. The President of Congress, often it's alluded to that the Articles of Confederation had no executive. There were those executive committees, as I mentioned, headed by non-members of Congress, but there was also a President of Congress that served sort of as the titular head of government. Foreign ministers would come and report to the President of Congress. Didn't have a whole lot of power, was more like a Speaker of the House of Representatives than a President of the United States. But there were certain executive duties that the President of Congress did perform. But basically, the executive departments were running governmental affairs under the Articles.
Some have suggested that the Articles were the logical extension of Revolutionary War principles. Would you agree or disagree to that the Articles were in fact a logical step?
I think the Articles were a logical step in the revolutionary thinking. Great fear of the executive in the form of the king and the king's ministers, and fear of Parliament way off in England. And so there was a sense that we didn't want to reestablish an imperial government here, either in Philadelphia or in New York City. We want a local government, and that's what we got to a great extent. The Congress, Continental Congress, sent out a resolution, dated the May 10th and 15th. That resolution was of 1776, was written by John Adams, and it called for the colonies to write new constitutions, jettison their colonial charters, and write new constitutions amenable to the people. John Adams thought this was quite revolutionary. His fellow delegate from New York felt that this was smacked of independence, he said, and John Adams said, no, this is independence. And so the state legislatures, the provincial legislatures in being at the time, for the most part, wrote their new state constitutions that gave pretty much authority to the states. They were sovereign. At the same time, the Articles of Confederation were being drafted, and the heart and soul of the Articles was Article 2, saying that the states retained their sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and Congress had only those powers that were expressly delegated to it by the Articles. Therefore, most of the authority, almost all of the authority, was left with the states, and the states were pretty much organized the way colonial government had been. That is, it was divided into different branches. There was a governor instead of a king, and instead of the royal governors, there was now a governor, usually elected by the legislature. There was a bicameral legislature, often a Senate or a council, and then the House of Representatives or Assembly, and then the judiciary. But even though there was lip service given, sometimes expressly stated, of the virtues of separation of powers, the fact of the matter was that virtually all power was located in the assemblies. And in the assemblies, they were elected by the people, and there were very, for the most part, very low property qualifications for voting and for holding office. And so many of the assemblies were controlled by farmers. And there was what was known at the time as mirror representation. That is, the general population would be mirrored in the assemblies. And so this guaranteed a lack of aristocracy. This is a dangerous element for many folks, and they opposed that, and they wanted some form of central control. James Madison in the spring of 1787 wrote letters saying, we need to reestablish king and council. He didn't want to reestablish a king, but he wanted some kind of supervisory authority over the state legislatures, which were experiencing what was being called at the time the tyranny of the majority. That is, democracy can be a very dangerous form of government, and in fact, that's what the Articles of Confederation and the state constitutions gave to America at the time. The will of the people would be expressed in their local government. Only a limited amount of authority would be given to the Confederation Congress, and in fact, they had no coercive power over the states. So this was indeed the fruition of the revolutionary principles in the eyes of many people. Others, from the very beginning of the Articles of Confederation and the state constitutions, thought that no revolutionary principles require more centralized control. And so this becomes a continuing political battle within the states.
Did the Articles of Confederation have any impact on how Europe viewed the Americans?
Certainly, European powers that were friendly to the United States, and that would be France and Spain and the Netherlands, and others also, but those three in particular, they wanted to see unification, and they felt that the American individual states were not sufficiently strong by themselves, and so they certainly encouraged the Articles of Confederation, drafting them, and then the implementation of them, taking so long until March of 1781. And so France in particular was quite pleased once the Articles were adopted. England didn't particularly care one way or the other. They felt that the Americans were inept, whether they be within the 13 states or whether they be in Congress. It was an inept government, and eventually they would see the light of day and want to come back in the British Empire.
Should the Articles have been given more time to see if they could evolve into a more viable government system.
Even before the Articles were officially adopted in March of 1781, there were proposals to amend the Articles. And so a proposal for a tariff, the impost of 1781, was proposed in February of 1781, a month before the official adoption of the Articles of Confederation. So everyone felt that the Articles needed to be refined, and no one objected to that. But the fact of the matter was that Article 13, that provided for amending the Articles, required unanimity of all 13 state legislatures, as well as the approval of Congress. And so this was virtually impossible to accept. There were a half dozen or so proposals for amendments or special grants of power to Congress. All of them failed. Some got very close, with one or two states lacking only. In fact, the impost of 1783 got all the states to approve, but every state had some kind of restriction, and the restrictions put upon the ratification by New York was too excessive for Congress to approve. And so there was the sense that we need amendments, and that should be done, but how should it be done? Men like James Madison wanted to work within the system as best as possible, but then the alternative became available, whether Madison saw the light of day or whether he was involved in the proposal of the Annapolis Convention that called together the states to meet to discuss commercial matters, and then the Annapolis Convention called for a general constitutional convention to consider all aspects of the Articles of Confederation, and there should be a convention. Pretty much all the states agreed that there should be some change, and that perhaps the General Convention method was the best way to go, since the other method had failed so much. But even when the Constitution was proposed, and it was doubtful whether it was going to be accepted or not, the question would be, what's the alternative? What's going to happen if the Constitution proposed in September 1787 is rejected? And so some folks would say, we'll call another General Convention, and we'll work out the kinks that had developed. After all, the first Constitutional Convention met in secret, didn't have any input from the outside authorities, outside other governments, the state governments, and so perhaps some feedback from the states would be beneficial. Others thought that a second Constitutional Convention would not work. It would fail. It would even be more partisan than the first one was. And so there was a sense that you had to go on and strive for more change. The question was, how was that to be adopted? The extremes would be a civil war and the forcible implementation of the Constitution. Several people put that forth. Several anonymous newspaper articles put that forth. Caesar, for instance, Caesar #2, put that idea forth. Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia put that idea forth. Perhaps the Society of the Cincinnati, this hereditary military fraternal organization, might be used to implement the Constitution by force. Others thought the way to do this is, given the fact that so many people now did accept the fact that there should be some amendments to the Articles, that going back the old traditional way would be acceptable, and that there would be a continued genesis change in the Articles. As I mentioned just earlier, there were these committees and then departments that were formed. And so the sense was, why can't we do that with more structural changes to the Articles? And so there was a sense that we could evolve into an American parliamentary system if we just took the time. And so that was another alternative. So Americans were willing to pursue change, whether the Constitution was adopted or whether it was rejected.
Let's shift our discussion to the Northwest Ordinance, the first bullet point in the question. What were some of the factors that prompted Congress to enact the Northwest Ordinance?
The obvious fact is you have a 900-pound gorilla in the room. That is, you have this huge amount of land, this national domain, and what are you going to do with it? People are flooding into there. The Indians live there. The Indians are not happy with the movement of white folks into that territory, and more white inhabitants are coming, mainly from the northeast, to settle along the Ohio River, in particular, where it's safest from the Indians. You also have the danger of the Spanish along the Mississippi, and the British along the Great Lakes. The British have not evacuated their forts in American territory as required by the Treaty of Peace of 1783, and the British are aiding the Indians in opposing American settlers, but at the same time the English are inviting Americans to come and settle in their territory, that is American soil, but controlled by the British, and also in British territory in Canada. And so the sense was that territory will eventually be taken over by the British. So this is a problem that exists, and the problem that was faced by Congress is that with Article 2 of the Articles, it says that Congress has only those powers that are expressly delegated to it. There is no power given to Congress to regulate territories. And so what do? You have a problem that must be addressed, but you have no constitutional authority. And so on various occasions, the Congress acted, and this is one of those cases where congressional authority was taken, and the Northwest Territory was addressed. First in 1785 with the mapping of the different, the surveying, I should say, of the territory, and deciding how it was going to be sold to individuals. And then came in 1787 the provision for the government of that territory. And that's known as either the Ordinance of 1787 or the Northwest Ordinance. And it's decided that this new territory was going to be divided into no more than 5 states. Jefferson had wanted 10 states back in 1784, and he gave them quite elaborate names sometimes, some ancient Greek names for these new territories, but that did not pass. And so in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance was passed, and the provision was no more than 5 states. The eastern states were worried that if there were more than 5 states, 10 like Jefferson wanted, they would be able to outvote the eastern states that were divided between the northeastern and the middle states and the southern states. And the western component of 10 states might be just too powerful. And so they should only be 5 states that were there. And so it's questionable whether this was a constitutional move or whether it was unconstitutional, or perhaps better, extra-constitutional.
Should we consider the Northwest Ordinance kind of the first expression of manifest destiny for Americans?
It certainly is a consideration that's there, but I would say when the first colonists came over, they had a sense of what would later be called manifest destiny. There was this empty continent there, ready to be inhabited by individuals. Land was cheap, land was available, and settlers should be given that land and should take the land and develop it. And so this is part of the American culture from the very beginning. And you see that particularly in New England, where Boston, for instance, it develops into a very successful town. It gets a population of 5,000 and then up to 15,000. And it just basically stays at 15,000 people for a long time because many immigrants are coming in, but as many folks are leaving. And they're establishing a new layer of towns going beyond Boston, and then a new layer beyond that. And so this was always a way to funnel the excess population going further and further out. And in fact, John Adams does refer to this as sort of the frontier thesis, well before Frederick Jackson Turner develops that thesis in American history in 1893. But Adams refers to this as a safety valve, a way to continue to allow land to be available for folks and for them to be, with that ownership, to have a part in government. And so that was always with the Americans, but certainly the Northwest Ordinance presents a unique opportunity for a territory as a whole to be considered. And what the delegates in Congress decide is fairly remarkable. They determine that this is not going to be a colonial offshoot of the states on the eastern coast. That once the states that are developed in the Northwest Territory reach a certain threshold of population, they can establish their own legislatures, their own governors, and that they would have representation in Congress on a par with the other states. They would have voting rights in Congress. And so there was going to be no colonial system in the Northwest Territory. So in that regard, it really adds a special dimension to this concept of manifest destiny that the Americans had. And there was the sense that the Indians were going to have to be removed because the Indians and the white settlers were not able to survive together, and therefore it was obvious that the Indians had to give way, this manifest destiny for the Americans. And eventually the British were going to have to evacuate those forts in the Northwest Territory. And so there was at the same time that the Northwest Territory was being settled, white Americans were also going into the Southwest Territory. The slavery provision was put in the Northwest Territory. No slaves were allowed, and that was fostered by the Southerners. They didn't want a competing Southern economy north of the Ohio River, and so slavery was prohibited. But by the same token, there was a sense that if overtly slavery is prohibited in the Northwest Territory, it was going to be allowed silently in the Southwest Territory. And in the Southwest Territory, that was growing by leaps and bounds, particularly in Kentucky and what would come to be Tennessee. In fact, 100,000 people settled into Kentucky during the Revolutionary years. And so that was going on simultaneously with the populating of the Northwest Territory. There was no particular ordinance like the Northwest Ordinance for the north of the Ohio River for the southern territories. They were allowed to develop on their own, and so their settlement was far more erratic than the settlements in the north. But there was the sense that Americans had that they were to expand to the Mississippi River. And in fact, Jefferson wrote saying that we'll go from coast to coast. And in fact, he wanted to expand that to Canada as well as South America. That's as far as manifest destiny went for Jefferson. A little bit later, he was a little bit more realistic, I think, thinking that maybe Cuba would be as far south as we would go. And he said that he would set up a sign saying, in the southern part of Cuba, saying, "This far and no further we would go." And so even before this concept of manifest destiny in the West was present, Americans were thinking in a very broad fashion as to what this new United States of America would be.
Well, thank you, John, and we look forward to spending some time with you in our next installment of the Ask John series.